Afternoon, my name is Dr. Fred Larsen. I am a fertility physician at Advanced Fertility Care here in Scottsdale, Arizona. I wanted to talk a little bit today about IVF milestones. What's it like to go through an IVF cycle? Well, it's actually a pretty long process. And depending on a lot of different factors, it can take as long as 3 or 4 months to get through the beginning of a cycle to your first pregnancy test. Actually, one of the first milestones that you have to get past when you're doing IVF is being able to start an IVF cycle. A lot of people don't realize that there can be times where you're planning to start a cycle, but your ovaries don't cooperate, and there's a cyst or something like that that makes us delay your cycle. And then there's the actual stimulation part of it itself, and that takes usually about 10 or 12 days and involves a lot of injections and monitoring and stuff like that. And then there's the big egg retrieval day where we harvest your eggs. On the day of the egg retrieval, if you are fertilizing your eggs, we do fertilizing that day, and we can tell the next day whether they fertilized. And so day one, we call it after your retrieval, so obviously an important day. You'll know how many embryos you're starting with. One of the ways we get such high success rates with IVF is the IVF lab, but in every step of the IVF lab, you end up with a little bit less than what you started in the step before. And so the number of embryos you start out with on day one, that's not going to be the number of embryos that that will be available for transfer. That's going to be less. And you'll find that out usually 5 days later, 5 or 6 days later. That's the time where we either biopsy and freeze the embryos or just freeze them without testing them. About 10 days later, if you've done the embryo testing, you'll know whether the embryo is normal or not. And then obviously we're hoping to move on to an embryo transfer, and that process takes at least 3 or 4 weeks. And then usually about 8 or 9 days after your embryo transfer, you'll have your pregnancy test. And if you've made it to the point of doing a transfer, you usually have a really good chance of being pregnant. And at least in our clinic, we follow you for about a month after you have found out that you're pregnant before turning your care over to your OB/GYN. So as you can see, it's a little bit involved process, a lot of steps involved, but that is how we get the high success rates.